Okay, so now we are on part 2 of our final talk, and here I wanted to talk about the poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, England in 1819. But before I do, I sort of have to say a few things, first about Shelley and second about the poem. We've talked about Shelley, of course, during the during our time together, but I wanted to say a couple things about the way that he thought about society, because I think it connects back to the ideas we had about liberation and occupation and resistance. And if you remember, I suggested that there's a connection in Romanticism, sort of generally, but certainly for Shelley, between the state of the child and the state of the society. So his attitude about society, the way he would decide about whether or not he felt like certain areas in Germany or Prussia or Switzerland or Italy were good and just societies, is he would base it on the general well-being and the attitudes of the children that he met. So he would travel around and he would meet these children and he would talk to them, and he would base his understanding about the society on the children. So that's one just sort of small little snippet of something I noticed in his letters, which might go to sort of help us understand his attitude about the relationship between society and the well-being of the least, as they say in Christianity, the least of these, right? So a few words about Shelley's afterlife and the way he fits into a longer history of the Romantic. A couple different things. Obviously, his writing was incredibly important to a number of writers, including Robert Browning, including Wallace Stevens, and then also including some of the beat poets, and also Hart Crane, people like that. So a very, very influential poet. But also, aside from his poetry, he's made a few really interesting contributions. Two would be vegetarianism, which you can sort of track from Shelley to George Bernard Shaw to Gandhi. So George Bernard Shaw, who was a big fan of Shelley, became a vegetarian through reading Shelley, and then Shelley has some essays that were published after his untimely early death about vegetarianism, and George Bernard Shaw read those and became a vegetarian, and Gandhi read Shaw and became a vegetarian. Also, nonviolent civil disobedience takes a similar sort of move from Shelley to Shaw to Gandhi through a text that Shelley wrote about the same incident that this poem, England 1819, is based, the Peterloo Massacre. That poem is called Mask of Anarchy, and it's rather long. That's why we're not reading it in this last class. Instead, we're reading the shorter text. But in that poem, Shelley famously says, lay down in front of the horses and the wagons and let them roll over you, and you will rise up. We will rise up, the larger than ever and more powerful than ever, and sort of something that we see then connected from Gandhi on to Martin Luther King Jr. and the whole movement for nonviolent civil disobedience. So a very powerful sort of after life for Shelley. In terms of the poem, we can see it's a sonnet. It was composed in 1819, obviously after the Peterloo Massacre. The Peterloo Massacre was a peaceful protest on St. Peter's Field, and what happened is the local government, or it's unclear exactly who, called in not necessarily the police, but they called in actually yeomen, which is a very interesting class of people, but it would be sort of like calling in the Hells Angels to deal with something. And so these yeomen went through this peaceful protest. First they were ordered to disband, and they didn't disband because they felt they were legally protesting, and they were protesting the price of bread and the corn laws and a number of things. It was very, very, it was a time of intense poverty, etc. And so that's what they were protesting. And what happened is that I think something like 19 people were killed by these yeomen riding horses with swords and just cutting people down. And that's what happened. So it was an absolute travesty, and the government was responsible ultimately. And so Shelley, who is living in Italy at this point, writes this poem, which I'll now read. It does not get published until 1839, so it's not like it had an immediate impact. Although it certainly had a huge impact in its afterlife, as has Mask of Anarchy, which I think was published in 1821. An old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flowed through public scorn, mud from a bloody spring. Rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling till they drop, blind in blood without a blow. A people starved and stabbed in the untilled field, an army whom libericide and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay, religion Christless, godless, a book sealed, a senate, time's worst statute, unrepealed, are graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. So, I'm not going to do a very detailed reading of this poem, but the first thing I sort of want to mention is the way that it opens with this attack on King Charles, an old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king. These rapid stresses, including a triple stress that begins at is really, really powerful to my mind. Also, you'll see that although it's supposed to be in a sort of iambic pentameter, which means that it would have 5 stresses per line, it has 6 stresses for the first line. So it begins kind of overwrought and overstressed, and I think that's a very powerful way for it to begin. There's really no other way for it to begin. There's no reason to be measured or calm here. It's a disaster, and Shelley was writing this probably 2 weeks after, because it took that long for the news to reach him. Maybe not quite that long, but he wrote it having just learned of it. He wrote several things and having learned of this attack. The other thing I want to sort of point out in terms of our idea about resistance is that he's making an argument that from all of this awfulness, a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. So in other words, I take that to be a figure for revolution. And, by this I mean something like the American or French revolutions, some kind of mass uprising. That would have been what was on Shelley's mind. And the other thing to mention here is that in terms of Shelley being a revolutionary, he didn't really have, he was very politically motivated and had a very strong anti-monarchical point of view. But I wanted to point out that, again, in his afterlife, Marx claimed Karl Marx claimed that Shelley, had he lived longer, would have become a socialist. I think it's fair to say that he kind of already was a socialist, but in any case, that's an interesting association. In terms of the way that he understands the society that he's writing about, which is the sort of English society, the princes and the king represent both a monarchy and an aristocracy which is polluted, mud from a muddy spring. And again, if we think about what Shelley thinks is the mark of a truly great, a truly alive person, is somebody who sees and feels and knows. We get this in Mont Blanc too, where he argues that those who, how does he put it? Who deeply feel, those who deeply feel or know, they can be understood, right? They can be communicated with, but not these people. Instead, they seem to be, he has a very interesting idea about power, not like the king himself is powerful, but rather he is a sort of flowing in this stream of power, as are these others. They are not themselves powerful. And this is interesting because think about Shelley's claims in Mont Blanc that power resides there, but it's power that could be usurped at any moment, right? What wert thou if to the human mind something and to the human's imaginings something and something were vacancy, right? Like so the power is really something much more mobile, much more fluid for Shelley. Obviously there's a critique of religion, there's a critique of the Parliament, and ultimately I think it ends with a kind of hope. So that's, I think, what I'll say about this poem right now, is that it gives us a way to understand this hopeful, revolutionary